real pleasure for me to welcome you to an event that is to commemorate the life and work of Gabriel García Márquez, Pride of Colombia and the Light of the World. Some years ago, a similar event to the one we are having today took place here in London. García Márquez was alive, and he sent a letter to the participants that I thought it would be a good idea to quote, because I want you to feel that part of his magic is here today with us. And the letter goes in this extract of his work. And I quote García Márquez. I know that you are gathered today to talk about my books and to read some fragments of my work. I would like to be there and read myself some lines. Many years ago, when I recorded the first chapter of 100 Years of Solitude, I discovered with delight that this was quite different from the silent and lonely reading of someone that devours a book sitting on his rocking chair. I discovered, as I heard the recording, a painful exercise indeed, that to listen to a novel was different to read it. Despite being the same, in some magic way, it was another novel with different emphasis of pronunciation, with highs and lows in the tonalities, with the pauses and moment of reflection when the reader stopped to read and allowed the listener to think. So it is my real honor to have you all here and to have these very important and selected panels that will discuss and exchange views about García Márquez's life and his literary genius. The moderator of this panel will be Georgina Godwin, who is a journalist, broadcaster, and books editor for Monocle 24. You can listen to her every day at 10 o'clock in Monocle Radio, and she just told me that on weekends as well. Dr. Gerald Martin is very well known of many of you, is the biographer of Gabriel García Márquez. It took him 17 years to finish it and over 300 interviews. He holds a BA from Bristol University and a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and he is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor Emeritus of Modern Languages at the University of Bristol. Edwin Williamson is a professor of Spanish studies at the University of Oxford, as well as offering research supervision on Latin American literature and cultural history and on aspects of the literature of the Spanish Golden Age. Professor Williamson gives a lecture course for both graduates and undergraduates on the making of Don Quixote and 2 seminar courses for graduates, history and the writer in Latin America. He recently published the biography of the writer Jorge Borges. Olivia Vazquez-Medina is a professor of Hispanic Studies at the Royal Holloway, University of London. She has a bachelor's degree in Hispanic literature from the Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico and obtained a master's degree in European literature and a PhD from the University of Oxford. She has done extensive research on García Márquez, novels, and work. So, with you, I leave you, Georgina, to start. Please.
Our host is Excellency Ambassador Néstor Osorio. Thank you. And welcome to all of you and of course to our distinguished panelists. I'd like to start with Gerald Martin, his biographer. If you tell us a little of Gabriel García Márquez's literary identity.
Well, I guess to talk about the literary identity, you also need to talk about the personal identity, because García Márquez is so much a writer from a place. Everybody knows, I expect, that he was born in a very small town, Rocafort, in Colombia in the 1920s. And that town was the origin of all his writing. It's the place which is effectively turned into Macondo in 100 Years of Solitude. But he's also from the region, which is the Caribbean coast, They sometimes call it the Atlantic coast and sometimes the Caribbean coast in Colombia. And Colombia is a country which is extraordinarily regionalized. One of Latin America's less well-known countries in many ways, although it ought to be one of the best known because it's one of the most interesting. And it's also got a Pacific and an Atlantic coast, and García Márquez is from the Atlantic coast. So he's very much a Caribbean writer. And magical realism, which is so associated with him, is very much a Caribbean movement as well. So he's from a very small town. It's very difficult to think of a 20th century writer of his importance who comes from such a tiny town, probably 5,000 or 6,000 people at the time that he was born. Then he's from the northern coast of Colombia, which of course is not dominated by the northern coast. It's always been dominated by Bogota, which is up in the Andes. He's from Colombia, which, as I say, he was very much aware of was not one of the best Latin American countries, best known Latin American countries. Not a Freudian slip, just he's above all a Latin American writer because all writers from countries of Latin America are also, and more importantly in many ways, Latin American writers. It's one of the things about the continent, which is that people are not so much part of Colombian literature or Mexican literature as they are of Latin American literature. And then the other thing about García Márquez is that he was probably the first writer to make the huge transition from just being a Latin American writer who was fairly well known in the rest of the world to being a Latin American writer who transformed things in the rest of the world. Vazquez, whom Edwin worked on, is in some ways the most universal of all Latin American writers, but he's not a writer who's probably read in Kabul or places like that to any extent. And García Márquez, in that sense, reached further in terms of popular readers. So that's the kind of background in terms of his life and the various places that he belongs to. And then if we think of literature, he's absolutely associated with this idea of magical realism, which many people think that he originated. And as I think of that, I think back to my first love in Latin American literature, who was Miguel Asturias, the Guatemalan, who probably was the first real exponent of magical realism, who died 40 years ago today. So just a moment for Miguel Ángel, as well as Godwin, if we're going to call García Márquez to some degree Godwin, as I always did. And yet, García Márquez, although associated with magical realism, which is so associated with the so-called Third World, began in many ways as a realist writer. He was more influenced by the Italian literature of the post-Second World War era. His first novels, if one thinks of one of his classics, the short classic No One Writes to the Colonel, that's a realist work, certainly not a magical realist work. And if you think of something like The Autumn of the Patriarch later on, the work that was so difficult for him to write after 100 Years of Solitude, when the whole world was waiting to see what he would do next, that book, you would really have to call it a modernist book in the sense of James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and Faulkner and those kinds of writers. In other words, he wrote something which was apparently an original new Third World thing, magical realist work, 100 Years of Solitude, and then he goes back to writing a modernist type work, The Autumn of the Patriarch. And then after that he moves on and does whatever he feels like. And particularly wrote, for example, his other most popular book, Love in the Time of Cholera, is a kind of telenovela of a high-class kind. So this is a writer who has a very strong image in the world, and yet it's actually perhaps more complex than we tend to think.
You're talking about magical realism, and Edwin, if we could come to you now, his name, of course, is synonymous with magical realism. As we've heard, he didn't actually invent it. But I'm interested in looking at how that sits within the context of Latin America.
Latin America. Well, just to take a very broad look at the context, I think magic realism is something that appears in the middle of the 20th century in Latin America. And as you say, it wasn't Garcia Marquez who invented this, but Miguel Asturias and also a Cuban writer called Rocafort. In fact, both of them were in Paris around about the same time, in the late 1920s, and there they mixed with surrealists, with French surrealists. And then they went back to Latin America, and they began to discover the indigenous cultures of their respective countries. So that Miguel Asturias trained as an anthropologist in Paris, and then became very interested not just in studying the culture of the indigenous communities in Guatemala, but somehow incorporating their myths and what we would call their fantasies into his own novels. And similarly, Carpentier went back to Cuba, and there he had already been very interested in the culture of the Afro-Caribbeans, former slaves in Cuba, which until that time, that culture was seen with a certain amount of contempt, shall we say, by the established society. And as a musicologist, he had tried to explore the value of the music of these black communities. But when he went back to Cuba, after his 10 years or so in Paris, he began to try, like Asturias, to incorporate the culture of the blacks into his own novels. And he started doing this in a very interesting novel called The King of This World, which he published in 1949. And the prologue to this King of This World is perhaps the founding text of Latin American magic realism. And it's a founding text because there he talks about the task of the Latin American writer. He sees the task of the Latin American writer as being quite distinct from that of the writer in North America or Europe. He saw Latin America as perhaps the cradle of a new civilization, particularly the Caribbean. And what he meant by that was that since the Enlightenment, Europe had perhaps created an over-rational culture. And we had to get back to a more integrated consciousness by trying to blend the rational consciousness of European Enlightenment with the instinctive, libidinal, intuitive imagination of indigenous communities. So he wanted somehow to fuse the modern with the pre-modern. And he got this idea basically from the French surrealists. The French surrealists had this idea, as you know, but he felt that in Latin America, one could live this sense of a consciousness which did not exclude the instinctive and the libidinal, but could somehow integrate it eventually into a new kind of transcendent consciousness. So this, I think, was very liberating for Latin American writers because this meant that they didn't have to feel a kind of cultural cringe in relation to Europe or the United States, that somehow the cultures that they had perhaps looked down upon had their own validity and, in fact, their own value and could be the source of a new cultural identity. And as you know, magic realism became very important for writers in the developing world, in Africa, in Asia, in the Indian subcontinent. So it was, I think, Alejo Carpentier who, in my view, started it. But Garcia Marquez has become very well known and associated with magic realism because I think Garcia Marquez has a different take from Carpentier. He really became a magic realist, as Gerald has just said, with the publication of Cien de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, which he wrote between 1965 and 1966, and published in 1967. So right bang in the middle of the decade of the 1960s. Now that was a very significant decade for Latin America, because that was a decade of great optimism, a great outburst of energy, a great sense that somehow Latin America could take its destiny into its own hands. And the reason for that was the success of the Cuban Revolution. And I think the success of the Cuban Revolution influenced Garcia Marquez, and I would say gave him a new take on magic realism. It gave him a kind of a more ambivalent attitude to the kind of aspirations that Carpentier had originally outlined in the prologue to The Kingdom as well.
Olivia, I'd like to explore his unique storytelling style and why and how it captivates readers everywhere.
I think part of the uniqueness of Garcia Márquez's storytelling style is the way in which the narratives are presented to the reader. So the figure of the narrator, or even the opening of some of his works, quite a few of them have from the opening lines, have the immediate effect of drawing the reader into the book. Just to think about the most famous one, Muchos años después, many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Coronel Aureliano Buendia was to remember the day when, the distant afternoon, I can't remember very well in English, I know better in Spanish, when his father took him to discover the eyes, so discover eyes. So we're from the beginning, we think, who is this man Aureliano Buendia? Why is he facing a firing squad? And moreover, why would someone be taken to discover eyes? So we are immediately asking all these questions, and we are presented with a story as if we knew the background to it. We are presented with something that has already happened, but without having been given the background, we want to know more about it. It is a similar pattern, I think, in Chronicle of a Death Foretold, when we start reading the book and we read, on the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nazar woke up at 5:30 at 5:30 in the morning. So from that point, we know that the protagonist of the novel is going to be killed, which is perhaps unusual, because we would, in a more traditional narrative, we would expect that to be revealed at the end. But from the beginning, we want to know why this man is going to be killed, who kills him, how is he going to be killed. So this immediately involves the reader and arouses the reader's curiosity to know more about it. Obviously, this is partly Garcia Márquez using quite sophisticated literary techniques, but at the same time, I think there is a certain resemblance to almost oral storytelling. Because if we think about, for instance, gossip, not that we gossip very much, but if you were going to tell somebody a story, guess what happened? This happened. And you attract the author's attention, and then you start telling the background. So I think there is both, and probably, obviously, Gerald will probably say, or has already mentioned about his literary identity, but there is both, I think, the literary, but also the faculty of the oral, the collective, very much present in Garcia Márquez's work. And I think another very important technique to bear in mind is the fact that even when we have a narrative told by a third-person narrator, sometimes this narrator adopts the perspective or the point of view of different characters in the novels. And so I think it's interesting when we read Garcia Márquez to ask ourselves, who is seeing this? From whose point of view are the events or the characters being presented? So, for instance, in 100 Years of Solitude, I would ask, are we really told that Remedios la Bella, Remedios the Beautiful, ascends into heaven, or we are being presented with somebody's vision of that, or with somebody's point of view of that? So I think these are all part of his very unique storytelling style and his way of really involving the readers into the narrative.
A very unique storytelling style and a very unique man, as you know, because of course you knew him personally. What can you tell us about your interactions with him?
I found it harder in the last 2 months to answer that question than I would have done before. It's been a very curious experience for me because for 17 years I was dealing with a living writer, even though he was obviously already a classic, and now he's a dead writer. I first heard about his death. I was sitting at home watching television the evening that he died, and a Spanish television station called my house and said, Mr. Martin, Gabriel García Márquez is dead. Do you have a comment? And I didn't know that he was dead, and I didn't have a comment. Though a couple of hours later I saw Ian McEwan on television, and by then he already did have a comment, and quite a wonderful comment. So it is very difficult, and the whole relationship of a biographer with a living writer is obviously a very complicated thing. And he and I solved the problem by kind of playing a game which we never discussed, but which we carried out almost from the beginning. And I always wondered why he allowed me to be his biographer, because he'd never heard of me, and almost nobody had heard of me. And he said yes. He gave me 10 minutes the first time. I'd been tracking him for 3 weeks in Havana. He gave me 10 minutes. Sent a car to pick me up at my hotel and said, "You've got 10 minutes." But I knew when he opened the door that he was going to say yes. I could just tell that he was going to say yes. And he was really the most extraordinarily intuitive man. There are famous examples of him knowing that things were going to happen that he couldn't possibly have known were going to happen. And I don't know if he knew that was going to happen, that I was going to walk in, and who knows. But from the very beginning, we pretended that we were friends. And we pretended that I wasn't his biographer. And I tried it out a couple of times, asking him deliberate, pointed questions. And he jumped, and I knew it was the wrong thing. I never took a tape recorder. I never took notes. I just went in, he offered me a drink, we sat down for 2 or 3 hours. Of course, I fed all the questions into the conversation, but I didn't ask them directly. And so for 17 years, we carried on like that, and that was the relationship. He was, of course, a biographer mythologizes everything, but I'm not the only one who's mythologized Garcia Márquez. He mythologized himself, and as we've seen in the last few months, the whole world has mythologized him. There has almost never been anything like the death of Garcia Márquez in terms of writers. You have to go back to somebody like Dickens or Mark Twain or Charles Chaplin to think of a cultural phenomenon, and I mean, it was worldwide. The Daily Mail did a huge splash on the death of Gabriel García Márquez. It was just extraordinary. I could not believe it. Why was that? It was because, straightforwardly and in vulgar terms, he was a genius, which you could tell, I could tell he was a genius, never having heard of him. The first moment I opened the page and read this quotation that Olivia has just mentioned from 100 Years of Solitude in Mexico City in 1968. I can still see myself sitting there. It's like one of those things when somebody dies. All I was doing was reading a book. By the time I got to the end of the first line, I knew this man was extraordinary, and that this was Latin American literature to come. By the time I got to the end of the first page, I was convinced he was a genius. The proof is I intended to teach it next term on my course in the university. And yet, he was the most ordinary, informal, lovable, funny above all, because our relationship was based on humour. That was really the thing that was most striking about him. He had this extraordinary sense of humour, and he could turn his sense of humour into sound bites, but they were sound bites that worked, that convinced everybody that they were the direct emanation of a person, of an authentic person. Ronald Reagan was good at that too, but I was never quite so convinced in his case that the sound bites were not carefully prepared in advance to seem like an ordinary. But anyway, let's not get into any of that. So here was somebody who was a high literary genius. There are people who don't think so, but more of us do think so. A high literary genius who at the same time was a man of the people. As you could see if you went anywhere with him, the most extraordinary things tended to happen. There was love everywhere that you went. Of course, there were people who hated Garcia Márquez for his relationship with Cuba. They hated Garcia Márquez because he didn't live in Colombia. They hated Garcia Márquez for a lot of different reasons, but overwhelmingly, people loved Garcia Márquez. He always said that he wrote his books so that his friends would love him more, which I just thought was an absurd thing to say when I first heard it. But then it turned out to be true, like so many of the things he said, which I assumed were not true before I knew him. but it turned out that they were true. He managed the biography extraordinarily well. He never tried to influence me. He never asked to see the final manuscript. He didn't tell me that I was his official biographer until I'd been doing it for 12 years, and he still didn't tell me. He told the world's press, and I never really was his official biographer. But obviously, there was a closeness there that I didn't entirely appreciate at the time. The relationship was based on humour, on jokes. Fortunately, I'm from central London. I was born in the same barrio as Charlie Chaplin, and the joking relationship from London helped me a lot with Garcia Márquez, because people from the Colombian Costa just do it all the time. So he joked all the time about me being an Englishman. He joked all the time about my terrible Spanish. He joked all the time about how I was never going to finish my book because I was too much in love with Colombia and would lose myself on the highways and byways. And he dedicated one of his books to me, to Gerald Martin, the madman who is pursuing me.
Gerald, you mentioned, of course, that he didn't live in Colombia for some of his life. But Edwin, his writing obviously centres on Colombia, and the fictional town of Monocle is based on his birthplace. So can you tell us more, we were talking about magical realism earlier, if you could tell us more about that and how particularly it works with in 100 Years of Solitude?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, magic realism is very much sui generis. It's quite different from kind of tales or stories and so on. And I actually think the distinctive characteristic of Garcia Márquez, magic realism, is humour. It is humorous. And as Jerry says, he was a man who could not get into humour, but that humour actually permeates his magic realism. There's a kind of a comic irony which plays under the surface in all his writing, especially so in 100 Years of Solitude, which is his masterpiece and which could be seen as, they say, the Bible of Latin American literature. It's so influential, so important. It's like the Don Quixote of Latin America. And I've sometimes wondered where he got this humour, this comic irony from. What's the source of that comic irony? And I think it derives from the way that, the particular way in which he handles the interplay of tradition and progress, which I think is intrinsic to Latin American magic realism, as I pointed out earlier on. And if you look at 100 Years of Solitude, in fact, it works, it's structured around a kind of interplay between tradition and progress. Even the way it starts, not the first page, but the way the action starts, we must bear in mind that the Buendías don't originate from Monocle, they originate from a real city called Riohacha. And this is a very traditional city. And José Alcalde Buendía falls in love with his cousin, Ursula Iguarán, and they get married. But she is very frightened that this semi-incestuous relationship is going to produce a child with a pig's tail. So she's full of superstitions, she's full of fear. He isn't. And eventually, he forces intercourse on his wife, Ursula, and decides at that point to leave Riohacha in quest of what he calls the benefits of civilization, in quest of science. So in a sense, José Alcalde Buendía is a progressive. He wants to leave tradition behind, whereas Ursula is a traditionalist. And I think that interplay runs throughout the whole novel. When they go in quest of science and civilization, they get lost in the middle of the jungle, in the middle of the outback. It's at that point that they found this little settlement called Macondo, which José Alcalde thinks is simply a staging post in his quest, but in fact becomes a place that Ursula wants to put down roots. So Macondo is this little town lost somewhere in the outback, strung between, halfway between traditional Riohacha and some mythical utopia called civilization, which José Alcalde wants to reach. In fact, all the characters in subsequent generations can be divided into progressives like José Alcalde and traditionalists like Ursula. And eventually, the progressives are always either defeated or always give up the struggle. So eventually, the traditionalists seem to win out, and in fact, at the very end of the novel, you do have the birth of the child with the pig's tail. So it looks as if Sula's fears, superstitions have come true, as if progress is impossible, as if time goes round in circles, as if the Macondinos, the Buendia family, are stuck in this rut forevermore. And that's at this point when a whirlwind comes and sweeps the whole thing away. So in that sense, Holloway is subject to be a very black, bleak, pessimistic novel, but it isn't. And the reason it isn't is that there is a final section where García Márquez introduces a whole new set of characters. There is a Catalan bookseller, and there are a number of young aspiring writers, among whom is a character called Gabriel Márquez. You'll notice the coincidence. Gabriel Márquez, Gabriel García Márquez. In other words, he puts himself into the novel. But why does he put himself into the novel? Because the Catalan bookseller advises the young men to leave Macondo. In the group of young men is the last of the Buendias, Aureliano Buendia. Aureliano Buendia is the only one in that group who does not take the advice of the Catalan bookseller and leave Macondo. Eventually he falls in love with his aunt, and they give birth to a child with pig's tail. But Gabriel Márquez does leave Macondo. He gets out. So the novel we're reading in Spanish is not the account of the Buendia family written by Melquiades in Sanskrit, but I would say it's the novel written by Gabriel Márquez once he has left Macondo and is looking back onto Macondo with great love, with a kind of nostalgia, with great affection, but also with a kind of ironic distance. So that's where the humor comes from. Romantic realism is he indulges his love of the traditional culture of his native Caribbean. He called a kind of bolero, a kind of melodramatic love song to the country that had made him. But ultimately, he leaves it and looks back upon it with a kind of distance, and in a sense, he doesn't make fun of the inhabitants of Macondo, but he realizes that their world is circumscribed, and their world, if it remains circumscribed, won't get them anywhere. But he has left, he has opted for progress, and therefore he's torn between love for the Macondo's work, but at the same time realizing that he has to opt for progress. And I think that option for progress is sourced in the great optimism I mentioned earlier, brought about by the Cuban Revolution in the 1960s. So why he is so special and why I think he attracts so many readers, because it's that wonderful sense of humor which he has somehow worked with very great precision.
Let's talk about those readers, Olivia, because we've spoken about his Colombian and his Latin American identity. But the point is that all over the world, readers feel involved with him, by him, want to read him still.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously García Márquez belongs to the canon of Latin American literature, but he's by no means confined to classrooms and libraries or read by small elite. He is widely read beyond Latin America, but also within Latin America, where perhaps perhaps reading is not as just reading for pleasure, is not as widespread as it might be in other countries. He is widely read, and as Gerald said, he is loved as an author, and he's very much present in the popular imagination. There's even a song called Macondo that is very popular in many countries in Latin America, and that refers to the characters in the book and to the events of 100 Años, 100 Years of Solitude. And obviously readers establish that intellectual relationship with these books, but it's also an affective relationship, I think, and part of it, I think, is probably a relationship with the man, and as Gerald has already said so much about him as a man who would be loved by his readers, and And I think also the humor that Edwin mentioned is very important. There's also the themes in his books, because his books deal with universal themes like love and solitude and illness and power and the loss of power and the loss of glory. And it's also the variety in tones. So we have humor, but we also can have a pathos and nostalgia. For instance, in a book like The General in his Labyrinth that deals with Simon Bolivar, there's also perhaps for certain readers, there's the magical side of it, or almost the exotic side of what is happening. So there's a certain exoticist appeal for some readers, perhaps. And then I think there's also the fact that García Márquez creates some endearing characters. Many of these characters have something exceptional about them, but they also have big flaws, and many of them have to endure loss or even fate working against them, and they can't do anything about that. So going back to, for instance, The General in his Labyrinth, even with a character that is so well known, a historical figure like Simon Bolivar, that will be very well known through history books by Latin American readers, García Márquez still manages to create somebody that the reader can feel both admiration but also sympathy and empathy with. So I think it's all these different factors that probably, behind his appeal for readers everywhere in the world.
There's so much to say, isn't there? And I'm aware that the time's marching on. So Gerald, if we could wrap up with you, really, telling us about his legacy.
I was just thinking about his sense of humour, actually. When I first saw him after the book was finished, and he read it, and I was absolutely petrified as to what he would say, and met him in a room full of people, and he said to me, well, he said, you finally made me famous. He said, I always wanted to be famous. He said, so I'm really grateful to you. The legacy, I've been saying for quite a long time, probably outrageously, but I have always thought that the writer who wrote 100 Years of Solitude was destined to last, I was going to say as long as human beings last, but that's certainly as long as the Western world lasts. And if people are reading books 500 years from now, by whatever means, I am absolutely certain that they will be reading that one. And I've always been certain that it was one of those books, one of those sort of children's classics, like Gulliver's Travels and Don Quixote, which they made us read bits of when we were, and I think they'll make children read bits of 100 Years of Solitude. I think he's one of those writers who's written one book which will be absolutely iconic. And I think when they look at the 20th century, they will say that the Latin American boom, of which he was a part in the 60s, which Edwin has mentioned, was an extraordinarily important world transforming movement, because what it did was to show that a continent like Latin America could assimilate the kinds of things that had been written in Europe and the US in the 1920s and 30s, and even start to go on beyond to some other thing, because a lot of people think that García Márquez is a postmodernist writer rather than a modernist writer, but we won't go too far into that. What I think, above all, people, I do think we have here Britain's expert on Don Quixote, Edwin Williamson, which is a big thing to be the expert on Don Quixote, and he is. And I've always said from the beginning that 100 Years of Solitude was Latin America's Don Quixote. And Don Quixote became a book not just for Spain, and not just an image of Spain, but also a book for the whole of Europe and indeed the Western world in that sense. And I think García Márquez's book is a kind of displaced equivalent. It is the Latin American novel. Since it existed, Latin Americans have shrugged their shoulders when anything's gone wrong in Latin America and said Macondo. In other words, a place where you aim for enormous things, but very often those things don't work. But you do keep aspiring, which is one of the most extraordinary things about Latin America. People have always said it's the home of dictatorship. No, it's the home of the aspiration towards freedom. It's not the home of dictatorship. Dictatorship may be a response, but it's the home of tremendous aspiration for freedom. And 100 Years of Solitude shows us that tremendous struggle among the many other things it shows. So what I think it is, I honestly do think this, in the 1960s and 70s we used to read Marshall McLuhan. And a lot of people laughed at him, but it isn't so funny now, because if you look back at Marshall McLuhan, there were a huge number of visionary things in his works about what was going to happen. You can certainly see the internet coming and cell phones and everything in Marshall McLuhan. You can certainly see my grandchildren staring into screens instead of staring out the window. And one of the concepts that Marshall McLuhan came up with was the global village. And I think that García Márquez turned Aracataca, his little hometown, into a global village, and into, in a sense, the first global village. Because what we see in Aracataca, in Macondo, in 100 Years of Solitude, is precisely that thing that we've been talking about for a long time, but which García Márquez saw and actually made real a long time ago, which is a place which is local, but also universal. He managed to do that at one and the same time. So he is the novelist who made the novel something which could be read the same way, or perhaps different ways, in different parts of the world, with different cultures, right across the planet. And I and lots of other readers of García Márquez had said this kind of thing a lot while he was alive. And it seemed obvious to us, but you still wondered. When I said, you know, this is the modern Cervantes, I thought, you actually trying to aggrandize yourself rather than García Márquez, or who knows what. Well, when he died, we saw him. When he died, the whole world may be wrong. The whole Spanish world thought that Blasco Ibáñez was an enormously important novelist beginning of the 20th century, but it's not talked about so much now. I would bet that García Márquez always will be. And I think that he was the first genuinely global novelist, for reasons which will take us a long time to fully understand. And that when we look back from centuries from now, we will see that very clearly. I mentioned Ian McEwan, and who would have imagined that a rather sober English novelist would say on the evening that García Márquez died, when asked where he would place him, he said he would place him in the best part of Parnassus, up very close to Shakespeare, of all things. And I myself have said several times that one of the things that could make you compare García Márquez with Shakespeare, from whom he is so different in so many ways, is that García Márquez concentrates on two key themes of all human experience. Power, on the one hand, think of all the things that connects to, and think of Shakespeare. And love, on the other hand, and think of all the things that that connects to. And García Márquez is one of the very few writers who, not just now and then, but consistently, totally, always writes about the interconnection of those two things. Power is always stopping us from loving, of course. On the other hand, it makes us pretend to love, and you can play this game a lot of different ways. So this is a writer who dealt with some of the great themes. He made them accessible to people across the world. He wrote such complex books that people in different cultures can read in different ways. If you want to laugh at Latin Americans, if you want to sneer at them, you can read 100 Years of Solitude. You can have a good laugh, because there's plenty of stuff in there about their failures. But if you want to think the other thing about how they understand life, how they understand that the moment is all we have, how they understand that you have to celebrate everything if you get the chance, how they understand that because we only have one life, which García Márquez believed, one of the things he said was, I don't believe in God, but I'm afraid of him. He believed anyway that we only have one life, and for that reason we have to look after each other, we have to fight for justice, and we have to enjoy every second that we get.
Gerald Martin, Olivia Vazquez-Medina, and Edwin Williamson. Thank you all so very much. and we begin with our host, His Excellency, the Ambassador Néstor Osorio, Ambassador of Colombia to the United Kingdom, and he'll be reading an excerpt from the first pages of 100 Years of Solitude.
Thank you very much. It appears as a natural thing that I start with the first lines of 100 Years of Solitude in Spanish. Muchos años después, frente al pelotón de fusilamiento, el coronel Aureliano Buendía había de recordar aquella tarde remota en que su padre lo llevó a conocer el hielo. Macondo era entonces una aldea de 20 casas de barro y caña brava, construidas a la orilla de un río de aguas diáfanas que se precipitaban por un lecho de piedras pulidas, blancas y enormes como huevos prehistóricos. El mundo era tan reciente que muchas cosas carecían de nombre, y para mencionarlas había que señalarlas con el dedo. Todos los años, por el mes de marzo, una familia de gitanos desarrapados plantaba su carpa cerca de la aldea y con un grande alboroto de pitos y timbales daban a conocer los nuevos inventos. Primero llevaron el imán, un gitano corpulento de barba montaraz y manos de gorrión que se presentó con el nombre de Melquíades, hizo una truculenta demostración pública de lo que él mismo llamaba la octava maravilla de los sabios alquimistas de Macedonia. Fue de casa en casa arrastrando los lingotes metálicos y todo el mundo se espantó al ver que los calderos, las pailas, las tenazas y los anafes se caían de su sitio y las maderas crujían por la desesperación de los clavos y los tornillos tratando de desenclavarse, y aún los objetos perdidos desde hacía mucho tiempo aparecían por donde más se les había buscado y se arrastraban en desbandadas truculentas detrás de los fierros mágicos de los Melquíades. Las cosas tienen vida propia, pregonaba el gitano con áspero acento. Todo es cuestión de despertarles el ánimo. José Arcadio Buendía, cuya desaforada imaginación iba siempre más lejos que el ingenio de la naturaleza y aún más allá del milagro y la magia, pensó que era posible servirse de aquella invención inútil para desentrañar el oro de la tierra. Melquíades, que era un hombre honrado, le previno: para eso no sirve. Pero José Arcadio Buendía no creía en aquel tiempo en la honradez de los gitanos, así que cambió su mulo y una partida de chivos por los 2 lingotes imantados. Úrsula Iguarán, su mujer, que contaba con aquellos animales para ensanchar el desenfrenado patrimonio doméstico, no consiguió disuadirlo. Muy pronto ha de sobrar no solo para empedrar la casa, replicó su marido. Durante varios meses se empeñó en demostrar el acierto de sus conjeturas. Exploró palmo a palmo la región, inclusive el fondo del río, arrastrando los 2 lingotes de hierro y recitando en voz alta el conjuro de Melquíades. Lo único que logró desenterrar fue una armadura del siglo XV con todas sus partes soldadas por un cascote de óxido, cuyo interior tenía la resonancia hueca de un enorme calabazo lleno de piedras. Cuando José Arcadio Buendía y los 4 hombres de su expedición lograron desarticular la armadura, encontraron dentro un esqueleto calcificado que llevaba colgado en el cuello un relicario de cobre con un rizo de mujer.
The Rt Hon Baroness Hooper, CMG. She's a British lawyer and a life peer at the House of Lords. Lady Hooper will be reading also an excerpt from 100 Years of Solitude.
Good evening. It's a great privilege to be asked to participate in this commemoration of a great author. But I must say it was very difficult to choose which piece to read out. I've ended up with a short excerpt from the middle of the book, which has always charmed me. It paints a vivid picture, and I think about it whenever I see a statue of St. Joseph. It comes at the moment when Aureliano II is coping with his unexpected and delirious prosperity. He papered the house inside and out and from top to bottom with 1 peso banknotes. The old mansion, painted white since the time they had bought the pianola, took on the strange look of a mosque. In the midst of the excitement of the family, the scandalization of Ursula, the joy of the people cramming the street to watch the apotheosis of squandering, Aureliano II finished by papering the house from the front to the kitchen, including bathrooms and bedrooms, and threw the leftover bills into the courtyard. Now, he said in a final way, I hope that nobody in this house ever talks to me about money again. That was what happened. Ursula had the bills taken down, stuck to great cakes of whitewash, and the house was painted white again. Dear Lord, she begged, make us poor again, the way we were when we founded this town, so that you'll not collect for this squandering in the other life. Her prayers were answered in reverse. One of the workmen, removing the bills, bumped into an enormous plaster statue of St. Joseph that someone had left in the house during the last years of the war, and the hollow figure broke to pieces on the floor. It had been stuffed with gold coins. No one could remember who had brought that life-size saint. 3 men brought it, Amaranta explained. They asked us to keep it until the rains were over, and I told them to put it there in a corner where nobody could bump into it, and there they put it, very carefully, and there it's been ever since, because they never came back for it. Later on, Ursula had put candles on it, and had prostrated herself before it, not suspecting that instead of a saint, she was adoring almost 400 pounds of gold. The tardy evidence of her involuntary paganism made her even more upset. She spat on the spectacular pile of coins, put them in 3 canvas sacks, and buried them in a secret place, hoping that sooner or later the 3 unknown men would come to reclaim them. Things like that, which gave Ursula such consternation, were commonplace in those days. Macondo was swamped in a miraculous prosperity.
Well, up next, Miss Miriam González Durántez, who is the president of Canning House, will be reading an excerpt of Chronicle of a Death Foretold.
Good evening. This passage comes towards the beginning of this book, and I have chosen it because I think that it exemplifies perfectly that kind of cyclical writing and the sense of anticipation that you can see in this whole book. Mi hermana volvió a casa mordiéndose por dentro para no llorar. Encontró a mi madre en el comedor con un traje dominical de flores azules que se había puesto por si el obispo pasaba a saludarnos, y estaba cantando el fado del amor invisible mientras arreglaba la mesa. Mi hermana notó que había un puesto más que de costumbre. Es para Santiago Nazar, me dijo mi madre. Me dijeron que lo habías invitado a desayunar. Quítalo, dijo mi hermana. Entonces le contó. Pero fue como si ya lo supiera, me dijo. Fue lo mismo de siempre, que uno empieza a contarle algo y antes de que el cuento llegue a la mitad, ya ella sabe cómo termina. Aquella mala noticia era un nudo cifrado para mi madre. A Santiago Nazar le habían puesto ese nombre por el nombre de ella, y era además su madrina de bautismo, pero también tenía un parentesco de sangre con Pura Vicario, la madre de la novia de vuelta. Sin embargo, no había acabado de escuchar la noticia cuando ella se había puesto los zapatos de tacones y la mantilla de iglesia que solo usaba entonces para las visitas de pesa. Mi padre, que había oído todo desde la cama, apareció en pijama en el comedor y le preguntó alarmado para dónde ir. A prevenir a mi comadre Plácida, contestó ella. No es justo que todo el mundo sepa que le van a matar el hijo y que ella sea la única que no lo sabe. Tenemos tantos vínculos con ella como con los vicarios, dijo mi padre. Hay que estar siempre de parte del muerto, dijo mi padre. Mis hermanos menores empezaron a salir de los otros cuartos. Los más pequeños, tocados por el soplo de la tragedia, rompieron a llorar. Mi madre no les hizo caso, por una vez en la vida ni le prestó atención a su esposo. Espérate y me visto, le dijo él. Ella ya estaba en la calle. Mi hermano Jaime, que entonces no tenía más de 7 años, era el único que estaba vestido para la escuela. Acompáñala tú, ordenó mi padre. Jaime corrió detrás de ella sin saber qué pasaba ni para dónde iban, y se agarró de su mano. Iba hablando sola, me dijo Jaime. Hombres de mala ley, decía en voz muy baja. Animales de mierda que no son capaces de hacer nada que no sean desgracias. No se daba cuenta ni siquiera de que llevaba al niño de la mano. Debiera pensar que me había vuelto loca, me dijo. Lo único que recuerdo es que se oía a lo lejos un ruido de mucha gente, como si hubiera vuelto a empezar la fiesta de la boda, y todo el mundo corría en dirección de la plaza. Apresuró el paso, con la determinación de que era capaz cuando estaba una vida de por medio, hasta que alguien que corría en sentido contrario se compadeció de su desvarío. No se moleste, Luis Santiago, le gritó al pasar. Ya lo mataron.
Thank you. Our next reader is Lady Gabriella Windsor. She's a freelance writer whose articles have been published in titles including Monocle magazine, the Sunday Telegraph, and the Ecologist. She'll be reading an excerpt of the short story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings.
It's an honour to be asked to read this commemorative event of Marquez. This is from A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, A Tale for Children. Translated by Gregory Rabassa. He could scarcely eat, and his antiquarian eyes had also become so foggy that he went about bumping into posts. All he had left were the bare cannulae of his last feathers. Palaio threw a blanket over him and extended him the charity of letting him sleep in the shed, and only then did they notice that he had a temperature at night and was delirious with the tongue twisters of an old Norwegian. That was one of the few times they became alarmed, for they thought he was going to die, and not even the wise neighbour-woman had been able to tell them what to do with dead angels. And yet, he not only survived his worst winter, but seemed improved with the first sunny days. He remained motionless for several days in the farthest corner of the courtyard, where no one would see him, and at the beginning of December, some large, stiff feathers began to grow on his wings, the feathers of a scarecrow which looked more like another misfortune of decrepitude. But he must have known the reason for those changes, for he was quite careful that no one should notice them, that no one should hear the sea shanties that he sometimes sang under the stars. One morning, Elisenda was cutting some bunches of onions for lunch, when a wind that seemed to come from the high seas blew into the kitchen. Then she went to the window and caught the angel in his first attempts at flight. They were so clumsy that his fingernails opened a furrow in the vegetable patch, and he was on the point of knocking down the shed with the ungainly flapping that slipped on the light and couldn't get a grip on the air. But he did manage to gain altitude. Elisenda let out a sigh of relief, for herself and for him, when she watched him pass over the last houses, holding himself up in some way with the risky flapping of a senile vulture. She kept watching him, even when she was through cutting the onions, and she kept on watching until it was no longer possible for her to see him. Because then, he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea.
From the short story The Saint, and this comes from Her Excellency, Mrs. Pilar Saborio de Rocafort, who is the Ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Kingdom.
Good evening. I've chosen to read an excerpt from this tale, The Saint, which is part of a collection entitled The 12 Pilgrim Tales. It was also made into a film for which García Márquez wrote the script, and it was a really fantastic film. I don't know if it's ever been translated or shown in other languages. I'll read in Spanish. ¿Qué pasó con la santa? Ahí está la santa, contestó, esperando. Solo el tenor Rafael Rivero Silva y yo podíamos entender la tremenda carga humana de su respuesta.
Conocíamos tanto su drama que durante años pensé que Margarito Duarte era el personaje en busca de autor que los novelistas esperamos durante toda una vida. Y si nunca dejé que me encontrara, fue porque el final de su historia me parecía inimaginable. Había venido a Roma en aquella primavera radiante en que Pío XII parecía una crisis de hipo que ni las buenas ni las malas artes de médicos y hechiceros habían logrado remediar. Salía por primera vez de su escarpada aldea de Tolima, en los Andes colombianos, y se le notaba hasta en el modo de dormir. Se presentó una mañana en nuestro consulado con la maleta de pino lustrado que por la forma y el tamaño parecía el estuche de un violonchelo, y le planteó al cónsul el motivo sorprendente de su viaje. El cónsul llamó entonces por teléfono al tenor Rafael Rivero Silva, su compatriota, para que le consiguiera un cuarto en la pensión donde ambos vivíamos. Así lo conocí. Margarito Duarte no había pasado de la escuela primaria, pero su vocación por las bellas letras le había permitido una formación más amplia con la lectura apasionada de cuanto material impreso encontraba a su alcance. A los 18 años, siendo el escribano del municipio, se casó con una bella muchacha que murió poco después del parto de la primera hija. Esta, más bella aún que la madre, murió de una fiebre esencial a los 7 años. Pero la verdadera historia de Margarito Duarte había empezado 6 meses antes de su llegada a Roma, cuando hubo que mudar el cementerio de su pueblo para construir una represa. Como todos los habitantes de la región, Margarito desenterró los huesos de sus muertos para llevarlos al cementerio nuevo. La esposa era pobre. En la tumba contigua, por el contrario, la niña seguía intacta después de 11 años. Tanto que cuando destaparon la caja se sintió el vaho de las rosas frescas con que la habían enterrado. Lo más asombroso, sin embargo, era que el cuerpo carecía de peso. Next we'll hear from Sir Martin Davison, KCMG, Chief Executive of the British Council. He'll be reading a passage from Love in the Time Colony.
Thank you, I'm delighted to be able to be here this evening. This is Dr. Urbino's parrot. He wanted a short siesta until it was time for Dr. Lacides Oliveira's gala luncheon, but he found the servants in an uproar as they attempted to catch the parrot, which flew to the highest branches of the mango tree when they took him from his cage to clip his wings. He was a de-plumed, maniacal parrot who did not speak when asked to, but only when it was least expected. But then he did so with a clarity and rationality that were uncommon among human beings. He'd been tutored by Dr. Urbino himself, which afforded him privileges that no one else in the family ever had, not even the children when they were young. He lived in the house for over 20 years, and no one knew how many years he'd been alive before then. Every afternoon after his siesta, Dr. Urbino sat with him on the terrace in the patio, the coolest spot in the house, and he had summoned the most diligent reserves of his passion for pedagogy until the parrot learned to speak French like an academician. Then, just for the love of the labour, he taught him the Latin accompaniment to the Mass and selected passages from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, and he tried without success to inculcate in him a working notion of the 4 arithmetic functions. On one of his last trips to Europe, he brought back the first phonograph with a trumpet speaker, along with many of the latest popular records, as well as those by his favourite classical composers. Day after day, over and over again for several months, he played the songs of Huguette Bibert and Aristide Bruant, who had charmed France during the last century, until the parrot learned them by heart. He sang them in a woman's voice if they were hers, and a tenor's voice if they were his, and ended with impudent laughter that was a masterful imitation of the servant girls when they heard him singing in French. The fame of his accomplishments was so widespread that on occasion distinguished visitors who had travelled from the interior of the riverboats would ask permission to see him. And once, some of the many English tourists who in those days sailed on the banana boats from New Orleans would have bought him at any price. the day of his greatest glory was when the President of the Republic, Don Marco Fidel Suarez, together with his entourage of cabinet ministers, visited the house in order to confirm the truth of his reputation. They arrived at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, suffocating in the top hats and frock coats they'd worn during 3 days of official visits under the burning August sun. But they had to leave as curious as when they arrived. Because for 2 desperate hours, the parrot refused to say a single syllable. Ignoring the pleas, the threats, the public humiliation of Dr. Olivia, who had insisted on that foolhardy invitation, despite the sage warnings of his wife.
We'll now hear from His Excellency Mr. Federico Alberto Cuello, who's Ambassador of the Dominican Republic to the United Kingdom, reading an excerpt of the short story Isabel Watching Rain in Monocle.
Good evening, everyone. If I may be allowed to indulge in my ownership of the microphone, I'd like to thank the Embassy of Colombia for having this great idea, for having invited us here, and especially for this excellent panel we have heard that has clearly established Gabriel García Márquez as a universal treasure that Latin America and Colombia in particular has shared with the world. I have chosen this fragment from a short story which I found in the complete short story collection published in 2010 as an ebook by a Spanish publisher called Rt, and I'm going to read straight from my iPhone. It's you will notice that among the topics that García Márquez addresses in his works, not only power, not only love, not only politics, but also nature, and in particular the weather, which I think is a topic, of course, of very popular treatment here in London and the rest of the UK. So, Monólogo de Isabel viendo llover en Macondo. By the way, I think this is the first time Macondo is mentioned in one of his works. This is a short story from 1955. El invierno se precipitó un domingo a la salida de misa. La noche del sábado había sido sofocante. Pero aún en la mañana del domingo no se pensaba que pudiera llover. Después de misa, antes de que las mujeres tuviéramos tiempo de encontrar el broche de las sombrillas, sopló un viento espeso y oscuro que barrió en una amplia vuelta redonda el polvo y la dura yesca de marzo. Alguien dijo junto a mí, es viento de agua, y yo lo sabía desde antes, desde cuando salimos al atrio y me sentí estremecida por la viscosa sensación en el vientre. Los hombres corrieron hacia las casas vecinas con una mano en el sombrero y un pañuelo en la otra, protegiéndose del viento y la polvareda. Entonces llovió. Del cielo fue una sustancia gelatinosa y gris que aleteó a una cuarta de nuestras cabezas. Durante el resto de la mañana, mi madrastra y yo estuvimos sentadas junto al pasamano, alegres de que la lluvia revitalizara el romero y el nardo, sedientos en las macetas, después de 7 meses de verano intenso, de polvo abrasante. Al mediodía cesó la reverberación de la tierra y un olor a suelo removido, a despierta y renovada vegetación, se confundió con el fresco y saludable olor de la lluvia en el romero. Mi padre dijo a la hora del almuerzo, cuando llueve en mayo, es señal de que habrá buenas aguas. Sonriente, atravesada por el hilo luminoso de la nueva estación, mi madrastra le dijo, eso lo viste en el sermón. Y mi padre sonrió y almorzó con buen apetito y hasta tuvo una entretenida digestión junto al pasamano, silencioso, con los ojos cerrados, pero sin dormir, como para creer que soñaba despierto. Llovió durante toda la tarde en un solo tono. En la intensidad uniforme y apacible se oía caer el agua como cuando se viaja toda la tarde en un tren. Pero sin que lo advirtiéramos, la lluvia estaba penetrando demasiado hondo en nuestros sentidos. En la madrugada del lunes, cuando cerramos la puerta para evitar el vientecillo cortante y helado que soplaba del patio, nuestros sentidos habían sido colmados por la lluvia, y en la mañana del lunes los había rebasado. Muchas gracias.
Next, we're going to return to Love in the Time of Cholera, and this reading comes from Mr. Colin Durántez, CBE-FRSL. He's President of the Royal Society of Literature.
Thank you. I'm delighted and honoured to be here. My chosen excerpt comes from Love in the Time of Cholera, which was translated by Edith Grossman. In it, the novel's aging protagonist, Florentino Alisa, is looking back on his past loves. He remembered Angeles Alfaro, the most ephemeral and best loved of them all, who came for 6 months to teach string instruments at the music school, and who spent moonlit nights with him on the flat roof of her house, as naked as the day she was born, playing the most beautiful suite of all music on a cello whose voice became human between her golden thighs. From the first moonlit night, both of them broke their hearts in the fierce laugh of inexperience. But Angeles Alfaro left as she had come, with her tender sex and her sinner's cello, on an ocean liner that flew the flag of oblivion, and all that remained of her on the moonlit roofs was a fluttered farewell with a white handkerchief, like a solitary sad dove on the horizon. With her, Florentino Alisa learned what he had already experienced many times without realizing it, that one can be in love with several people at the same time, feel the same sorrow with each, and not betray any of them. Alone in the midst of the crowd on the pier, he said to himself in a flash of anger, "My heart has more rooms than a whorehouse." He wept copious tears at the grief of parting, but as soon as the ship had disappeared over the horizon, the memory of another woman once again occupied all his space. He remembered Andrea Varone, outside whose house he had spent the previous week, but the orange light in the bathroom had been a warning that he could not go in. Someone had arrived before him. Someone, man or woman, because Andrea Varone did not hesitate over such details when it came to the follies of love. Of all those on the list, she was the only one who earned a living with her body, but she did so at her pleasure and without a business manager. In her day, she had enjoyed a legendary career as a clandestine courtesan who deserved her nom de guerre, Our Lady of Everybody. For her sake, Florentino Alisa had violated the sacred principle of never paying, and she had violated hers of never doing it free of charge, except with her husband. They had agreed upon a symbolic fee of 1 peso, which she did not take and he did not hand to her, but which they put in the piggy bank until enough of them had accumulated to buy something charming.
His Excellency Mr. Ivan Romero is Ambassador of Honduras to the United Kingdom and will read a piece from Chronicle of the Dead Water.
El día que lo iban a matar, Santiago Nazar se levantó a las 5:30 de la mañana para esperar el buque en que llegaba el obispo. Había soñado que atravesaba un bosque de higuerones donde caía una llovizna tierra, y por un instante fue feliz en el sueño, pero al despertar se sintió por completo salpicado de cagada de pájaros. Siempre soñaba con árboles, me dijo Plácida Linero, su madre, evocando 27 años después los pormenores de aquel lunes ingrato. La semana anterior había soñado que iba solo en un avión de papel de estaño volaba sin tropezar por entre los almendros, me dijo. Tenía una reputación muy bien ganada de intérprete certera de los sueños, siempre que se los contara en ayuno, pero aún no había advertido ningún augurio aciago en esos dos sueños de su hijo, ni en los otros sueños con árboles que le había contado en las mañanas que precedieron a su muerte. Tampoco Santiago Nazar reconoció el presagio. Había dormido poco mal, sin quitarse la ropa, y despertó con dolor de cabeza y con un sedimento de estribo de cobre en el paladar. Y los interpretó como estragos naturales de la parranda de bodas que se había prolongado hasta después de la medianoche. Más aún, las muchas personas que encontró desde que salió de su casa a las 6:05 de la mañana hasta que fue destazado como un cerdo una hora después, lo recordaban un poco soñoliento, pero de buen humor, y a todos les comentó de un modo casual que era un día muy hermoso. Nadie estaba seguro de si se refería al estado del tiempo. Muchos coincidían en el recuerdo de que esa era una mañana radiante, como una brisa de mar que llegaba a través de los platanales, como era de pensar que lo fuera en un buen febrero de aquella época. Pero la mayoría está de acuerdo en que era un tiempo fúnebre, con un cierto turbio y bajo y un denso olor a aguas dormidas, y que en el instante de la desgracia estaba cayendo una llovizna menuda como la que había visto Santiago Nazar en el bosque del sueño. Yo estaba reponiéndome de la parranda de la boda en el regazo apostólico de María Alejandrina Cervantes, y apenas si desperté con el alboroto de las campanas tocando a rebato, porque pensé que las habían soltado en honor de lo mismo. Muchas gracias.
Next, we'd like to call on Her Excellency Mrs. Esther Armenteros, who is Ambassador of Cuba to the United Kingdom. She'll read the last page of Love in the Time of Cholera.
Good evening. I am very honored to pay homage today to Godwin, a great friend of Cuba. Cuando ya no quedaba nada que comer en los platos, el capitán se limpió los labios con la esquina del mantel y habló en una jerga procaz que acabó de una vez con el prestigio del buen decir de los capitanes de Río. Pues no habló por ellos ni para nadie, sino tratando de ponerse de acuerdo con su propia rabia. Su conclusión, al cabo de una lista de improperios bárbaros, fue que no encontraba cómo salir del embrollo en que se había metido con la bandera del cólera. Florentino Ariza lo escuchó sin pestañear. Luego miró por las ventanas del círculo completo de la rosa náutica, el horizonte nítido, el cielo de diciembre sin una sola nube, las aguas navegables hasta siempre, y dijo: sigamos derecho, 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 otra vez hasta la redonda. Fermina Raza se estremeció, porque reconoció la antigua voz iluminada por la gracia del Espíritu Santo y miró al capitán. Él era el destino. Pero el capitán no la vio porque estaba anonadado por el tremendo poder de inspiración de Florentino Ariza. ¿Lo dice en serio?, le preguntó. Desde que nací, dijo Florentino Ariza, no he dicho una sola cosa que no sea en serio. El capitán miró a Fermina Daza y vio en sus pestañas los primeros destellos de una escarcha invernal. Luego miró a Florentino Ariza, su dominio invencible, su amor impávido, y lo asustó la sospecha tardía de que es la vida más que la muerte la que no tiene límite. ¿Y hasta cuándo cree usted que vamos a seguir en este ir y venir del carajo?, le preguntó. Florentino Ariza tenía la respuesta preparada desde hacía 53 años, 7 meses y 11 días con su lucha. toda la vida.
Of Love and Other Demons, and it comes from His Excellency Mr. Bernard Matias Romero, who is Ambassador of El Salvador.
Good evening, and thank you so much for allowing us to be part of this homage to Gabriel. I had a little bit of a problem in choosing a passage to read, because I knew that a lot of the most popular novels were going to be read before me. But I wanted to choose a passage that had a sense, that showed a sense of history, society, but also cultural syncretism that portrays Latin America so much. So I chose this passage that I hope you like. Del amor y otros demonios. La casa había sido el orgullo de la ciudad hasta principios del siglo. Ahora estaba guinada y lóbrega, y parecía en estado de mudanzas por los grandes espacios vacíos y las muchas cosas fuera de lugar. En los salones se conservaban todavía los pisos de mármoles ajedrezados y algunas lámparas de lágrimas con colgados de telaraña. Los aposentos que se mantenían vivos eran frescos en cualquier tiempo por el espesor de los muros de calcanto y los muchos años de encierro, y más aún por las brisas de diciembre que se filtraban silbando por las rendijas. Todo estaba saturado por el relente opresivo de la desdicha y las tinieblas. Lo único que quedaba de las ínfulas señoriales del primer marqués eran los 5 mastines de presa que guardaban las noches, el fragoso patio de los esclavos, donde se celebraban los cumpleaños de Sierva María, había sido otra ciudad dentro de la ciudad en los tiempos del primer marqués. Siguió siendo así con el heredero mientras duró el tráfico torcido de esclavos y de harina que Bernarda manejaba con la mano izquierda desde el trapiche de Mahates. Ahora todo esplendor pertenecía al pasado. Bernarda estaba extinguida por su vicio insaciable y el patio reducido a 2 barracas de madera con techos de palma amarga, donde acabaron de consumirse los últimos saldos de la grandeza. Dominga de Adviento, una negra de ley que gobernó la casa con puño de fierro hasta la víspera de su muerte, era el enlace entre aquellos dos mundos, alta y ósea, de una inteligencia casi clarividente. Era ella quien había criado a Sierva María. Se había hecho católica sin renunciar a su fe yoruba y practicaba ambas a la vez, sin orden ni concierto. Su alma estaba en santa paz, decía, porque lo que le faltaba en una lo encontraba en la otra. Era también el único ser humano que tenía autoridad para mediar entre el marqués y su esposa, y ambos la complacían. Solo ella sacaba a escobazos a los esclavos cuando los encontraba en descalabros de sodomía o fornicando con mujeres cambiadas en los aposentos vacíos. Pero desde que ella murió, se escapaban de las barracas huyendo de los calores del mediodía y andaban tirados por los suelos en cualquier rincón, raspando el cucayo de los calderos de arroz para comérselo o jugando al macuco y a la taravilla en la fresca de los corredores. En aquel mundo opresivo, en el que nadie era libre, Sierva María lo era, solo allí y solo ella. De modo que era allí donde se celebraban las fiestas, en su verdadera casa y con su verdadera familia. No podía concebir un bailongo más taciturno en medio de tanta música, con los esclavos propios y algunos de otras casas de distinción que aportaban lo que podían. La niña se mostraba como era, bailaba con más gracia y más brío que los africanos de nación, cantaba con voces distintas a la suya en las diversas lenguas de África, y con voces de pájaros y animales, que los desconcertaban a ellos mismos. Por orden de Dominga de Adviento, las esclavas más jóvenes le pintaban la cara con negro de humo, le colgaban collares de santería sobre el escapulario del bautismo y le cuidaban la cabellera que nunca le cortaron y que le habría estorbado para caminar, de no ser que las trenzas de muchas vueltas que le hacían a diario. Gracias.
Ms. Rt Hon is an award-winning documentary producer. She is currently producing a documentary about Garcia Márquez, and she'll read a passage from News of Kidnapping.
Good evening. Well, perhaps Love and Time of Cholera is definitely a book that first inspired me to travel to Colombia, but I think that News of a Kidnapping is definitely a book that most resonates with the work that's taken me back to the country. And I've chosen a passage which comes at the end of a particularly traumatic episode of kidnapping. Back home that afternoon, he realised that daily life was returning to normal. Andreas was studying in his room. Maruja was waging a difficult, silent war against her phantoms in order to become herself again. The Tang Dynasty horse was back in its usual place, between her prized mementos of Indonesia and her antiquities from half the world, rearing its front legs on the sacred table where she wanted it to be, in the corner where she dreamed of seeing it during the interminable nights of her captivity. She had returned to her offices at Procini in the same car, the bullet scars on the windows erased, from which she had been abducted, with a new, grateful driver in the dead chauffeur's seat. In less than 2 years, she would be named Education Minister. The emissary, with no job and no desire to have one, with the bad taste of politics in his mouth, chose to rest for a time in his own way, making small household repairs, taking his leisure sip by sip with old drinking companions, doing the shopping himself so that he and his friends could enjoy the pleasures of the local cuisine. It was the perfect frame of mind for reading in the afternoon and growing a beard. One Sunday at lunch, when the midst of memory had already begun to rarefy the past, someone knocked at the door. They thought Andreas had perhaps forgotten his keys again. The servants had the day off, and the emissary opened the door. A young man in a sports jacket handed him a small package wrapped in gift paper and tied with a gold ribbon, and then disappeared down the stairs without saying a word or giving him time to ask any questions. The emissary thought it might be a bomb. In an instant he was shuddering with the nausea of the abduction, but he untied the bow and unwrapped the package with his fingertips, away from the dining room where Maruja was waiting for him. It was a case made of imitation leather, and inside the case, nestled in satin, was the ring they had taken from Maruja on the night she was abducted. One diamond chip was missing, but it was the same ring. Maruja was stunned. She put it on and realised she was recovering her health faster than she had imagined because now it fit her finger. How incredible, she said with a hopeful sigh. Someone ought to write a book.
And now we come to Ms. Cristina Fuentes de la Roche, who's Director of Hay Festival for the Americas and Director of Hay Festival Cartagena. She'll read an excerpt of the speech given by Gabriel García Márquez upon receiving his Nobel Prize for Literature. That was on the 8th of December, 1982.
Gabriel was one of these few writers that we invited to the Hay Festival year after year, and he always said no. He didn't like the English weather, he didn't speak good English, he didn't particularly like public speaking. So one year, Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican writer, his very good friend, told us, why don't you go to Colombia? If he doesn't come to Hay, what are you over? So that's what we did. 10 years ago, we set up the first Hay Festival in Cartagena de Indias. Carlos introduced us to Gabo. We became great friends. He was a great patron, guest of honor of our festival many years. And now we work very closely with his Genomics Foundation. Apart from being an amazing fiction writer, Gabo was a journalist. That's how he started to write. And he was as well deeply involved and interested in Latin American fate. That's why I have chosen this piece of his speech at the Nobel Prize winning ceremony, The Solitude of Latin America. So we start reading in Spanish. No pretendo encarnar las ilusiones de Toño Grover, cuyos sueños de unión entre un norte casto y estudio apasionado exaltado a Thomas Mann hace 53 años en este lugar. Pero creo que los europeos de espíritu clarificador, los que luchan también aquí por una patria grande, más humana y más justa, podrían ayudarnos mejor si revisaran a fondo su manera de vernos. La solidaridad con nuestros sueños no nos hará sentir menos solos, mientras no se concrete con actos de respaldo legítimo a los pueblos que asuman la ilusión de tener una vida propia en el reparto del mundo. América Latina no quiere ni tiene por qué ser un alfil sin albedrío, ni tiene nada de quimérico, que sus designios de independencia y originalidad se conviertan en una aspiración occidental. No obstante, los progresos de la navegación que han reducido tantas distancias entre nuestras Américas y Europa parecen haber aumentado, en cambio, nuestra distancia cultural. ¿Por qué la originalidad que se nos admite sin reservas en la literatura se nos niega con toda clase de suspicacias en nuestras tentativas tan difíciles de cambio social? ¿Por qué pensar que la justicia social que los europeos de avanzada tratan de imponer en sus países no puede ser también un objetivo latinoamericano con métodos distintos en condiciones diferentes? No. La violencia y el dolor desmesurados en nuestra historia son el resultado de justicias seculares, de amarguras sin cuento, y no una confabulación urgida a 3.000 leguas de nuestra casa. Pero muchos dirigentes y pensadores europeos lo han creído. Con el infantilismo de los abuelos que olvidaron las locuras fructíferas de su juventud, como si no fuera posible otro destino que vivir a merced de los dos grandes reyes del mundo. Este es, amigos, el tamaño de nuestra soledad. Sin embargo, frente a la opresión, el saqueo y el abandono, nuestra respuesta es la vida. Ni los diluvios ni las pestes, ni las hambrunas ni los cataclismos, ni siquiera las guerras eternas a través de los siglos y los siglos han conseguido reducir la ventaja tenaz de la vida sobre la muerte. Una ventaja que aumenta y se acelera. Cada año hay 74 millones más de nacimientos que de defunciones. Una cantidad de vivos nuevos como para aumentar 7 veces cada año la población de Nueva York. La mayoría de ellos nacen en los países con menos recursos y entre estos, por supuesto, los de América Latina. En cambio, los países más prósperos han logrado acumular suficiente poder de destrucción como para aniquilar 100 veces no solo a todos los seres humanos que han existido hasta hoy, sino la totalidad de los seres vivos que han pasado por este planeta de infortunios. Gracias.
Well, I now hand you back to our host for this evening for some closing remarks. His Excellency, Néstor Osorio.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been quite an evening, and you will agree with me that Gabriel García Márquez has been with us tonight. I want to thank the illustrious panel, Georgina, Gerald, Olivia, and Edwin, for enlightening us with the analysis and interesting anecdotes about what was to know García Márquez, what was to read García Márquez. And to our speakers, my colleagues, the ambassadors and the illustrious, the British friends that have been with us, my gratitude. You have been great, and you have communicated with us in a language that for us was once a surprise, and today is a common one. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the public here to be with us tonight. Good night.